Senator Byer Suckoo, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, this morning I rise to move the second reading of the Appropriation Bill 2018. Madam President, this bill provides for the grant of a sum of money out of the Consolidated Fund and the appropriation of the same for the service of Barbados for the year ending 31st of March 2019, of course beginning 1st of April 2018. And it speaks to a grant of $1,744,410,904, Madam President. Madam President, this morning it is my honor to have the opportunity to lead off this debate. This is actually, as I was thinking about it, this is actually my 11th estimates debate in the Parliament, but it is a signal honor for me, Madam President, to be here to lead off this estimates debate this year. And I'm excited about this estimates debate. I'm excited about the document and the figures that we bring before this House this morning, Madam President, because for me, these represent more than tables and charts and numbers. Madam President, what we have brought to this chamber and what we will put forward to this chamber over the course of the next 3 days, Madam President, actually represents encouragement and hope for Barbados, because we will clearly show that we have a way forward charted for Barbados. This speaks to responsible government, Madam President. This exercise that we are undertaking today, it speaks to responsible government. It is also the responsibility of the government, as in the Constitution, I believe it's section 109 of the Constitution, that speaks to having at the earliest possible opportunity before the 1st of April to bring the estimates debate, the appropriation bill to this chamber. But responsible government is not just, Madam President, about bringing facts, about bringing figures here, about having a sum of money approved. It's about managing the purse. In fact, it is about more than managing the purse. It is even more so about managing the country, and it is about leading people, enabling the people of Barbados, Madam President, to identify their purpose, to identify their passion, because I, for one, believe that when you follow your passion, you actually find your purpose. And it is about allowing that space, that enabling environment, if you will, for Barbadians to follow their passion and to find their purpose in the process, Madam President, to realize the goals that they set for themselves, for their families, for their children, Madam President, and ultimately for every Barbadian to become members of this society, responsible, contributing members of this society. As a nation, Barbados is now 51 years, Madam President, as we all know, and we all participated in the celebrations of our 50th anniversary, which were important for our nation, significant celebrations. 50 is a milestone that one should celebrate, and I'm looking forward, Madam President. I guess the cat is out of the bag. I recently said on a political platform, so it's the cat is out of the bag. I turned 50 this year, so I'm looking forward to celebrating. I hope there's more in there than just the applause, though, than just the applause. So I'm giving you good notice, Madam President, you and my colleagues, Madam President. In September of this year, I turned 50, and we are accepting gifts all year round. Of course, I don't look a day past 27. Of course, my 28-year-old son has a challenge with this because his mother now looks younger than him. But that is on the side, Madam President. But, Madam President, we celebrated our 51st anniversary last year. For the year, our 50th year, we highlighted our achievements, and it is clear to every Barbadian that we did well for those 50 years, Madam President. We, as a nation, as a people, we were able to do just those things that I identified just now. We were able to identify our passions, to follow our passions, to pursue careers, to pursue goals, Madam President, to pursue educational goals, to acquire material wealth, so that the Barbados of today looks nothing like the Barbados of 1966. We are different. We drive different cars, we drive more cars, our roads are different, our buildings are different, our houses are different, Madam President. We have achieved a lot. But some will argue, Madam President, that that achievement may have been one-sided. The argument is, of course, made that man is more than physical. Man is a spiritual being, emotional, mental as well. And we need to find that balance in our pursuit, Madam President. We as a nation have done well in pursuing and acquiring wealth. But balance is about more than that. We have to acquire that spiritual development. We have to look after our bodies as well, or ensure we have healthy bodies, build healthy relationships, Madam President. And relationships, not only those intimate relationships with our family, but also relationships with our community, our neighbors, even our church. And that is where, Madam President, some may say that we have been one-sided, because we've been so busy pursuing our personal goals that we've lost sight of goals as a community in many respects, maybe not entirely, but we may have begun to do so. We, Madam President, my generation certainly, has spent more time in school than my parents did. Spent perhaps not more time at work, but I believe that the work I do is less labor intensive than the work my parents did. As I said, we have bigger houses, bigger cars. We spend more time in gyms or walking on the boardwalk or on the beaches or on wherever we go to walk, Madam President. We spend more time taking our children to lessons, taking them to sports, taking them, Madam President, to swimming, karate, you name it, football, violin, everything. But we spend less time, Madam President, in church. We spend less time taking our children to church. We take them everywhere else but to church. And we spend less time with our neighbors, getting to know our neighbors, getting to know our neighbors' children. And we spend less time, Madam President, I posit, meeting the needs of others. And so because of this, we are starting to see, as many have articulated, tears in the fabric of our society. Runs in the stocking, if you will, if any people still wear stockings. Runs in the stocking, Madam President. And we have to deal with this now. Anybody who's ever had a run in the stocking knows that a stitch in time saves 9. You have to deal with that run right away. Otherwise, the stockings are no good. And the elderly lady who has joined us this morning is nodding because, of course, she knows a lot about stockings, Madam President. But yes, we have to, a stitch in time saves 9. We have to deal with it. And Barbadians agree. Madam President, we've mentioned before the values survey that was done in Barbados. Our Prime Minister, when we celebrated our 50th anniversary, he did commission a study based on the questions that he asked Barbadians. What are those things that we have lost as a community that we need to reclaim? What are those things that as a community we have that are serving us well and we need to retain those things? And what are those things that we've acquired along the way that have not served us well and we need to discard them as soon as possible? And Madam President, it's been published. It's been, I'm not sure the document actually has been a document of the House, but Madam President, the survey was the study was done by Salises, and I want to thank them for that. And they went out to Barbadians. And Barbadians, for example, identified that we need to retain the sense of community. That is what has served Barbados well. That's what tourists like when they come to Barbados. That's what those of us who grew up in the villages love about Barbados, that sense of community. Barbadians identify that we need to retain that sense of community. Our values of religion, on education, Madam President, law and order, and good governance. Those are things that we have, that have served us well, and we need to hold near and dear to our hearts. We need to retain those things. Barbadians also identified that in cases where we've lost some of that, where we've let slip away a little bit of the community values, the law and order, the respect for elders and authority, even religion and family, where we've lost those things, personal responsibility as well, and our national identity, we may have lost some of that, maybe not entirely. But Barbadians identified that where we have lost that, we need to grab hold of it, bring them back, reclaim them, because those are things that serve Barbados well, Madam President, things that we need to continue. And of course, we've said it before in several debates in this chamber, and Barbadians agree that there are things that we need to discard. The violence, Madam President, the crime, drugs, the substance abuse, Madam President, guns. Barbadians identify that there are changes in our culture that are foreign to us, that may have come from North America, and they don't think that some of those changes are doing us well. We need to get rid of that. Not my words, Madam President. This came from the study that Salisis did. And that perhaps we have begun to reject hard work. We need to discard that rejection of hard work. And this laid-backness and this entitlement, Madam President, this is what Barbadians said is creeping into our society, not serving us well, and we need to get rid of those things. And so, Madam President, having heard what Barbadians have said, and it resonates with us because it is what we have said not only on this side, but across this table, Madam President, and across Barbados, we are hearing people say these things. So these are things that go into our planning for the estimates. As I said, our estimates are more than just tables and figures. Our estimates speak to us creating the society that will see us discarding these things and trying to get rid of these things that are not serving us well, and holding on to those things that have served us well, that have helped us to build this society, and that we need to keep on. So that is why I took the time, Madam President, to just highlight some of that, to set the stage for my presentation on the appropriation bill and the estimates, because that is what this represents, how we're going to run the government to get us back to that point, to get us to where we need to. Yes, it is about spending, but it's about where we spend and how we spend and on what programs and to what effect. We also have before us, Madam President, and I will make reference to it, and it is a document of this chamber, the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan. And that goes hand in hand with the estimates, because if you look at the estimates, again, it speaks to figures. But the Sustainable Recovery Plan 2018, Madam President, that actually articulates the priorities. It articulates some of the areas that we need to address. It speaks to some challenges and some proposed solutions, and how we're going to get to goal, who is going to have the responsibility for those things. It articulates a framework, giving timelines and responsibility to different agencies, and to see us actually achieving some of those things that we need to achieve. And again, this document is not just about economic recovery. It speaks to sustainable recovery, but it speaks to us having the kind of economic recovery that would allow us also to do those social things, to have the social services that we need, to ensure that we have those, we give to our society the things that we as government need to give to them, to ensure that there's a space, Madam President, that I described for people to pursue their passion, and to ensure, Madam President, that we keep people employed. All of that underpins this Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan. So as I speak, and I'm sure my colleagues will do likewise, Madam President, you will hear reference being made to this Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan for 2018. And of course, it charts our work from now. You would see as you look through the document, Madam President, there are some deadlines there that we have for April 2018, June 2018, and so on, going right down to seeing us achieving certain goals by 2020, 2021, and 2022. So it's taking us through that period, Madam President. At the end of the day, Madam President, we put a lot of emphasis on creating the type of society we want. I know some folks have said it's become a cliche that we stand here and say Barbados is more than an economy, Barbados is also a society. But what use is it, Madam President, for us looking to improve our foreign reserves, for us to improve our fiscal balance, Madam President? What is the use of doing all of that if at the end of the day we don't have a society that we feel comfortable in, if we don't have a society that we feel comfortable in, and we cannot become the type of people we want to be and realize the goals that we have set for ourselves? If we can't even dare to realize goals for ourselves, we want a Barbados where our children can dream and where our children can set goals, any goals, lofty goals for themselves, and work towards achieving them. It is about giving them hope. And that's why I said these estimates are about encouragement, Madam President, and these estimates are about hope. In our own households, we know it doesn't make sense amassing wealth and then we don't have the time to spend it. We hear of too many people who have created a lot of wealth for themselves, and then at the end of the day, what is it they regret when their time comes to an end? Yes, they have money, but they regret not spending the time with in the relationships. People, it's about community. That is what is important, Madam President. So we will not be one-sided, but we will be multidimensional. As I said, we as a people, humans are multidimensional. We are not just about the physical and the material, but we are multidimensional. So we have to address all of that. As I said, there may be a run in the stockings, but you can't pull apart a run. If you know a pair of stockings, if you pull it apart, Madam President, the run gets worse. What you do, the old-time darning, I'm not sure if anybody in this room knows how to darn anymore, Madam President. I'm not sure if you know how to darn. Madam President says she knows how to darn. But the darning is about bringing those ends together to ensure that you stop that run and that we can have an intact garment, Madam President. And so that is what we are about. It's about bringing people together. It's about bringing those ends of society that have frayed apart, bringing them together so that we can build that society. And so we have to wherever possible, Madam President, dismiss those voices and those urgings that would see us trying to pull apart our society. At the end of the day, it is not going to do us any good. We cannot tear down our country with a kind of negativity, Madam President. I've spoken to it several times before. You know, I believe, Madam President, maybe because I was raised in the church, but I do believe philosophically that the power of life and death is in the tongue, and that we have to continue to affirm ourselves and to speak life, to speak positively into what we have and into what we do. Because when you continue to berate yourself, berate your efforts, berate your neighbors, Madam President, at the end of the day, you cannot be satisfied with what you have. You cannot be satisfied with where you live. All of a sudden, where you live is the worst place in the world, and that is not the kind of thing that anybody wants. We want to feel, and we want to be proud that Barbados is still the best place in the world. But you can't do that if you can't drown out the voices that are telling you otherwise, Madam President. And so we have to drown out those voices and instead speak positively, speak life, Madam President, because that's what is important. Because when we do that, then we would also start to understand that each one of us has a responsibility to get our society where we want it to be. Madam President, we've highlighted the woes many times. But you know, I think it is time that we started to take personal responsibility. For example, we talk about our young people. I think each one of us needs to take responsibility for getting involved in the life of at least one other young person and helping them along the way. We talk about our environmental challenges. Each one of us, we need to take responsibility for how we treat to our garbage, how we dispose our garbage, how we reuse and recycle, and how we pollute or not pollute, Madam President. Those are the things that we have to do. We talk about productivity in this country, but productivity is always somebody else's problem. We have to take personal responsibility and realize that when each of us decides that we will give an honest day's work, not just in terms of time, but in terms of the quality of our work, then we will then start to see productivity improve in our country. It's not a public sector thing. It's not a private sector thing. We have to accept it as a personal thing, Madam President. And each of us take responsibility for doing the best, for giving a full day's work when we are at work, Madam President. A little more on top too, but we have to take that responsibility personally, Madam President. You know, it's not about with eye service. In the book of Colossians, I believe it is, we are exhorted not to work with eye service as men pleasers, but work as if unto the Lord. But no, it's I think Colossians chapter 3, if I'm not mistaken. But we are, that was one of my favorite verses growing up. That's why I remember it's Colossians 3. One part of it is verse 23, but I think it starts at around verse 20 or 21. Yeah, I went to Sunday school every Sunday, sometimes twice on Sunday. But yes, Madam President, but again, to understand, and as I said, Barbadians want us to get back to hard work, get back to those values of hard work. I highlighted some of those things from the values survey. Barbadians said that they want us to discard this where we've rejected hard work, discard that notion that hard work is bad for us, discard this laid-backness and this entitlement. And it goes back to us when we go to work, not working with eye service when we think the boss is looking, but doing our work as unto the Lord, knowing that He is looking at our every step. And that is what we are about. So I want to encourage, even if I don't get the chance to say it throughout for the rest of my presentation, let us stop the blaming and stop the negativity and be positive. Madam President, I encourage us. If I can go back to the scriptures, Hebrews, the writer, and I know there has been much dispute as to who the writer of the book of Hebrews is, but the writer of the book of Hebrews, he did exhort us that because we have such a great cloud of witnesses, let us, press on towards the mark. I'm getting some, is that approval I'm getting from the Dean? But Hebrews, Madam President, chapter 12, yes, wherefore seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. And Madam President, that conjures up a notion of sports. And I've been thinking about it. The Winter Olympics are on now, and it's in its 10th day. And there are folks, they're cheering on their team, but they're also cheering on others. You cheer on the underdog, you cheer on the person who may have fallen in the race, the person who may have slipped when in the course of their routine. You cheer that person on. Madam President, when we go to cricket, and you cheer on your team, but when the other side hits a six, you cheer them on too, and when there's a spectacular catch, you cheer them on. Because that great cloud of witnesses, Madam President, they're there and they're cheering on the athletes. That's the image. But Madam President, what we have in this country though, and it is sad to say, that instead of even cheering on the underdog, you don't just cheer on the one who's coming first. We have some people sitting in the bleachers in this country, and all they do is boo Barbados. No matter, they're not cheering you on for making any progress. Yes, you might not be number one, but they're tearing you down. We need to be cheering on our team, Madam President. Yes, we need to be cheering on our team. But instead, we have a Barbados Labour Party, if I might specify, sitting in the bleachers, booing everything that is done in this country, booing everything that happens in this country, Madam President. And that's not even sportsmanlike. In sports, you encourage even the underdog, even your opponent, you cheer for them when they do something good. But that doesn't happen in here. So yes, we know that we have challenges, and they've been articulated, and you will hear it again, Madam President, the low foreign reserves. We have issues with our broken sewage system, Madam President. We have potholes. We have some areas that have some bush, Madam President. All of those are hurdles, Madam President. The hurdles are meant to be overcome, and we can overcome. And as team, we need to be cheering on Team Barbados from the sidelines, cheering them on over the hurdles. It is not the end, Madam President. Our opposition, Madam President, aided and abetted by some in the media, by the social media, Madam President, they try to frighten us, to depress us, to undermine even our pride in this country, Madam President. They do. You could see that is the aim. I contend, Madam President, Barbados is still the best place to live. Our health system, our education system, our law and order in this country, Madam President, our values of religion, the stability we enjoy in this country, the social services, Madam President, our social security, the friendliness and warmth of our people, the quality of our air, the quality of our water, the quality of our beaches, all of which have been tested, Madam President. The quality, all of these are excellent. And we, Madam President, live in the best place in the world. So Barbadians, don't let anybody rob you of your pride. Not the opposition who will spit in the soup, pardon the expression, I know it's an ugly one, Madam President, but because you can't have the soup, you're going to spit in the soup, Madam President. At the end of the day, it is all of us, and we are all of us to partake of the soup, Madam President. And so I encourage all of us to continue to work together, Madam President, because we still have a lot. Again, I noticed that there are folks pointing to the estimates, Madam President, but again, as I've said, it is about context. It is about understanding that these facts and figures mean something. I could go outside and put this book outside and it means nothing to the people of Barbados with all the numbers until they understand why the government is looking to spend $1.7 billion and what we're looking to spend that money on, where it is going, and why we think that those areas are priorities. And this, Madam President, is something the opposition does not understand. They do not understand that you don't spend money for the sake of spending money. If they did, the squandermania of all the hundreds of thousands of dollars they spend on posters that are now fading on the streets, they would not have spent that kind of money. It is not just about spending money. It is about having a vision, Madam President, and it's about understanding where you're spending it and why you're spending it, because you have a goal to improve the lives of the people of Barbados, Madam President. But that's what these estimates are about, Madam President. These estimates and the debate that we will have over the next few days is about allowing us to refocus our vision. As I said, we have the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan that will go hand in hand with our work for the next year and beyond. There are a lot of positives, Madam President, and I will speak to those as well. There are a lot of positives, and there is a way forward. But we have to drown out the boos that are coming from the bleachers, Madam President. We have to drown them out. The boos from the bleachers, the boos of the BLP from the bleachers. The boos of the bees from the bleachers, yes? Yes, that's alliteration. And so, Madam President, we have before us the estimates of 2018, 2019, the financial year 2018, 2019, as I said, for the year that begins the 1st of April 2018 and runs up to the 31st of March 2019. Of course, to continue putting it in context, Madam President, we do have to look at 2017-2018. Madam President, for 2017-2018, we did note that we did have an improvement in our revenue. There was less expenditure on wages, less expenditure on goods and services, but we did see an increase in the transfers, and of course we will be speaking more to those transfers, Madam President. But certainly, Madam President, the fiscal program that we approved this time last year for 2017-2018 actually showed current revenue of $2.963 billion, Madam President, and current expenditure exclusive of amortization of $3.154 billion, and capital expenditure of $427.4 million. While the projections on an accrual basis showed a net operating balance of negative $191.7 million, or negative 2% of GDP, when converted to the cash basis, the projection was for a fiscal deficit of $426.1 million. The overall deficit, inclusive of amortization, was expected to be financed by foreign sources in respect of capital project inflows estimated at $112.9 million and $1.4356 billion from domestic sources. So, it was originally estimated, Madam President, that current revenue on the accrual basis would have been $2.9 billion. And when converted to the cash basis, an amount of $2.938 billion would be collected during that 2017-2018 fiscal year. Provisional data from the Accountant General for the period April to December of last year, Madam President, show that the government actually collected a current revenue of $1.9165 billion, an increase of $202.7 million, or 11.8% more than current revenue for the same period in the previous fiscal year, 16-17. And it is projected, Madam President, that for the remaining months of the fiscal year, January, February, and March, that $312.6 million, $246.6 million, and $524.1 million will be collected, to yield revised current revenue, Madam President, of $2.9998 billion. That, of course, Madam President, is more than was projected originally. In fact, it is $61.6 million more than what was collected originally, Madam President. The amount of $3.1348 billion was projected on the accrual basis for this current financial year that is drawing to an end. and that is $241.9 million, or 8.4% more than the actual amount for the previous year, 2016-17. Taxes on property are expected to increase from the corresponding period in the previous year by $2.2 million to $189.9 million. Taxes on goods and services, as I said, those also increased. They're expected to increase by $119.8 million to $1.462 billion. The increase in taxes on goods and services is, of course, Madam President, mainly due to the increase in VAT and excise tax of $36.2 million and $83.7 million, respectively. Taxes on income and profits are expected to decrease, Madam President, by $2.3 million. Corporation tax is expected to increase by $21.4 million, and income tax and withholding tax are expected to decrease by $0.6 million for the income tax and $20.5 million for the corporation tax. But I am advised that by my colleague, Minister of Finance, that of course the withholding tax is the tax that often gets waived anyhow, so they're not too worried about that one. Special receipts are projected to increase by $41.9 million, due primarily to an increase in the National Social Responsibility Levy, and that, as we all know, last year increased from 2% to 10%. That increase, Madam President, is $114.1 million. Taxes on international trade should realize $241.7 million, a decrease of $3.5 million. Non-tax revenue is expected to increase by $89.5 million, Madam President. And it is noted that there is money in there, Madam President, that has been included as an installment from the sale of the Hilton Hotel. Madam President, that is the revenue. So you see that in terms of the revenue, we have observed an increase in revenue. In terms of the current expenditure for this 17-18 financial year, the provisional data from the Accountant General, Madam President, for April to December indicates that government incurred current expenditure of $2.994 billion, Madam President. That includes amortization, and that is an increase of $60.6 million, or 2.1% from that of the 16-17 fiscal year. It is projected that for the 3 remaining months, the last quarter of the year, for which we only have provisional figures, Madam President, it is projected that for January, $390.6 million, February, $400.8 million, March, $487.9 million will be spent, so that the revised current expenditure, inclusive of amortization, of $4.2733 billion is to be expected. This, of course, is $55.4 million than was approved on the cash basis for this current financial year. Expenditure on wages and salaries, however, Madam President, that is expected to decrease by $2.9 million. And expenditure on goods and services is also expected to decrease by $1.2 million from the previous financial year. There were some supplementaries, Madam President, we did see from the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Health, and so on. Current transfers, Madam President, and we speak at length to current transfers, and these are expected to increase by $48.6 million, which is actually 4.3% over the actual amount from 2016-2017, and that increase will bring it to $1.190 billion. The supplementaries that were approved, Madam President, that will bring that figure up include the Transport Board for operating costs, $20 million, the University of the West Indies, $45 million, Queen Elizabeth Hospital, $17.6 million. These are the supplementaries, not what was originally in the original estimates. And the Sanitation Service Authority, an additional $7.8 million, as well as National Housing to cover in the main the legal counsel. In the case of the Byer Construction Limited versus the National Housing, that is for that building, which actually houses my ministry, Madam President, there in Warrens. And $4 million to cover the land surveying fees. As we mentioned, the 20-year divestment program required some legal work as well as some surveying work. And so there are costs in there for the surveying and engineering assessments also that had to be done in that respect. Total debt payments, Madam President, were expected to be $362.3 million, or 23.4% more than the previous year. The interest costs also are up, while amortization payments would increase by $321 million. And as I said before, and we will be saying it here again, it is important for government to look at the current transfers and how we can bring those transfers down, which speak to efficiency in the state-owned enterprises, but we also have to see how we can manage our debt as well. That is a very important part of the discussion of these estimates and of the program of the government, and indeed reflected in the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan, how we treat to our debt management as well, Madam President. And capital expenditure, Madam President, was also expected to increase. Of course, we know of the work that was done at Queen's Park House, lovely renovation that was done there to the Queen's Park House. And then there were monies for the David Thompson Clinic in it's the David Thompson Health and Social Services Complex in St. John. So, Madam President, you see that was just a snapshot of the figures. But again, the figures mean nothing when you just put them out there, Madam President. Again, what it does reflect is that we have seen an increase in revenue, which was one of the aims of the last budget, one of the aims articulated in the last estimates exercise. We saw an increase in revenue. We also noted, again, if I can repeat, Madam President, that there was a decrease in the expenditure on wages and the expenditure on goods and services. And we have also highlighted that there are those troubling areas that we have to continue to work on, Madam President. These are positives, Madam President, but you know, when we start to read the reports that are published on our financials, Madam President, you would get the impression that there are no positives at all. For example, Madam President, just recently the Central Bank also issued their performance report and review of 2017, and if you went by some of the headlines, you would think that everything was wrong, because the headlines, of course, would have accentuated the fact that the reserves, the foreign reserves, are down, and we seem to then just only focus on that and not realize that in there, Madam President, there were also some things that we need to celebrate. As I said, we need to be on the sidelines cheering our team along. They may not be coming first in the race, but we need to cheer them on. Barbados has continued to experience growth, Madam President, in a very difficult environment. Barbados has continued to experience growth. It has been slow, but slow and steady, we will succeed. It has been slow. It is not where we want it to be. We have to work on that. But there has been growth. Let us not tear ourselves down and say we've done nothing. There has been growth, but it has been slow. Economic activity, Madam President, has increased, according to the Central Bank, for the 3rd consecutive year, Madam President. A modest increase, but an increase nonetheless. We need to accentuate the positives. We need to push our team on and say, look, you are doing it, you're getting there. You need to step it up, but encouragement. Any of you have a child that is not getting on with the work, when they bring home a poor report, you don't, I hope you don't flog them and send them to stand in the corner. You work through the challenges, Madam President. You say, well, look, this is better than last year. You're getting there. You cheer on your children when they're not quite where you want them to be. You cheer on your athletes when they're not quite where you want them to be. We may have given up cheering on our cricket team, but for the most part, we cheer on, but for the most part, Madam President, we cheer on our athletes, we cheer on our children, sports are going on all like now, knapsack and the primary school sports and so on. And everybody's there cheering on their children. And when you have the little one and the infants who turns to run the wrong way, you don't boo the little one. If you've ever been to infant sports, Madam President, when everybody's running one way and the little one turns to run the other way, you cheer them on, you push them on, Madam President, because that is what support is about. And that is what we need to be doing. We need to be cheering on the fact that we have made progress, Madam President. We have achieved some growth. We need more, but we have achieved some growth. Economic activity continues, Madam President. We have seen an increase in economic activity. The fiscal deficit is down, Madam President. We have seen that, Madam President. Our fiscal deficit is down by $197 million, according to the Central Bank of Barbados, Madam President. Our deficit is the lowest that it has been in 7 years, Madam President. All of these are positives that somehow have fallen by the wayside because we only focus on the negatives, Madam President. We've seen, as I said, revenues increase, and we've seen the non-interest expenditure stabilize, Madam President. We've seen tourism earnings go up. We've seen an increase in tourism activity. The banks, according to the central banks, the banks are liquid. They've seen greater profitability. There's been a reduction in the non-performing loans, Madam President. The central bank is funding the government less, Madam President, by $96.8 million less, Madam President. These are things that we have to celebrate. These are positives that we... It used to be, right, it used to be 714.5 million, and it is now reported at 96 million, 96.8 million, down from 714 million to 96.8 million. These are things that we're not highlighting. As I said, we're not bigging up these things. And the people, the team that is behind there doing these things, the Minister of Finance, the team in the Ministry of Finance, the Central Bank, and all those line ministries that are responsible for keeping expenditure down. These are things that these poor people, they are working so hard, achieving these results. And all we are hearing is, oh dear, nothing is going right in Barbados because our foreign reserves are falling. We have to encourage the team that is responsible for these kinds of gains, Madam President. We have to encourage them. And the central government debt to the central bank and to national insurance, that is down also, Madam President. We are moving in the right direction. We want to pick up the pace, yes. But you don't pick up the pace by booing the athletes. When your athlete picks up the pace, when you encourage them, you tell them, well done, you push them on, you cheer them on. You hear the cheers coming from the stands. That great cloud of witnesses, Madam President. That's how you get the team moving forward. You don't boo them and expect them to move forward faster. Team Barbados, our civil servants, Madam President, the public servants, Madam President, our ministers, Madam President, the Cabinet of Barbados, the Central Bank, and Madam President, the private sector and the social partners in the labor movement. Everybody is coming together as Team Barbados to work to make this a reality. We have, at the very least, to support them and cheer them on, Madam President. That is what we have to do. Yes, of course, we have made gains, and we must continue to build on those gains, Madam President. We have to continue to reduce the fiscal imbalance. And, Madam President, we have to continue to reduce the debt to GDP. That is, of course, important. And we want to ensure that there's greater confidence, that our private sector, for example, has greater confidence in how we are doing business, greater confidence in how we're managing our money, Madam President, so that they can invest and then create more jobs, be more productive, produce more, Madam President, and see our economy grow. That is what we want to encourage. We want to see greater inflows, and the central bank governor did say this. We want to work so that we can see greater inflows, not only in the public sector, but also in the private sector as well. But we will continue to work in that direction. And again, I commend to you the Sustainable Recovery Plan, because while I can't go into it page by page, Madam President, it does highlight the challenges and what we're not hearing enough of from other quarters, Madam President. It actually highlights solutions and who has a responsibility to carry out these different activities. And it's bringing some oversight to it, some monitoring, Madam President, and as I said, it's articulating clearly which agency has a responsibility, the timelines for doing it, and our social partners are coming together as an oversight subcommittee, I believe it is a social partnership oversight subcommittee, to actually ensure that this happens. And they'll be working with not just line ministries, but we have the competitive action teams as well. They're a part of this, and that's another social partnership arrangement as well, a tripartite arrangement. So everybody is coming together as part of this team to ensure that we get to goal, Madam President. Everybody is coming together, and we're on the same page. Most of us, Madam President, we're on the same page because most of us genuinely want to see Barbados improve. Most of us genuinely believe that Barbados is worth the effort, that Barbados, that we have a gem here, and that we need to do everything we can to keep this gem intact, to ensure that it continues, Madam President, to be the best place, and not just to pull it down by our very words, Madam President. That is what we have to ensure. So yes, we're dealing with the challenges, debt servicing, and so on. We're not going to forget that, but we have to keep a balanced view. Otherwise, it can be very demoralizing, very demotivating, and that's the trouble we have. You know, Madam President, there is a song, I didn't realize it was that old. It goes back to 1944. Johnny Mercer and the Pied Pipers. And it was then later done by Bing Crosby and the Andrews sisters. I don't know if any of my older colleagues in here would know the song. It says, you got to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative, don't mess with Mr. In-Between. You got to spread joy up to the maximum, bring gloom down to the minimum, have faith, or pandemonium liable to walk upon the scene. To illustrate Jonah in the whale, Noah in the ark, what did they do just when everything looked so dark? This is a song I'm quoting, Madam President. Man, they said we better accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative, and don't mess with Mr. In-Between. Don't mess with Mr. In-Between. Says, listen to me, children, and you will hear about the eliminating of the negative and the accent on the positive. Gather round me, children, if you're willing, and sit tight while I start reviewing the attitude of doing it right. That's a song that I know some of my, yes, you wouldn't know that song, but it is that song, Madam President, is about accentuating the positive. Change will come because Barbados will continue to work together to ensure that we bring about improvements in our situation. That is the only change that this country needs right now. In fact, you know, Madam President, as I've been moving around Barbados, it occurred to me, in fact, it didn't occur to me, the observation was made to me by somebody who'd been walking around with me, and they said, you know, Madam President, as we walk around, there may be people who speak to us, and for one reason or another, sometimes with no fact at all, they may not prefer a particular Democratic Labour Party member, parliamentarian, candidate or whatever. But they prefer the party as the party to continue to lead Barbados, Madam President. They prefer the Democratic Labour Party. While and the corollary to that, Madam President, is that while they may prefer a particular Barbados Labour Party person, in the main, they don't prefer the Barbados Labour Party as a party, Madam President, not to get us out of where this country is now, not just economically, because Barbadians realize that it is not just an economic challenge that we have, and they do not trust any other party to bring us out economically, environmentally, and socially, Madam President. And they do not trust any other party with the good governance that they have seen from this Democratic Labour Party. They do not trust another party to bring it. They have not forgotten the corruption and the squandermania. They have not forgotten it. How could they forget it? We are still smelling hell because of it, Madam President. So they still prefer the Democratic Labour Party to lead us out. So any change that is coming, Madam President, is the change to how we are going to step up implementation, the change to how we are going to manage our fiscal debt, the change to how we are going to deal with our state-owned enterprises. That is the change that is coming. There ain't no other change. So my colleague on the other side can just relax and prepare his speech for later in the week, Madam President. And so, Madam President, I've just looked back at what we've achieved in 2017-18. I've given you some figures and the experiences that we had in 2017-2018. And, Madam President, so we have to look forward to 2018, 2019. But you know, Madam President, before I go there, let me also highlight, I mentioned the figures. And yes, we did have some improvements in expenditures, some improvements in revenues and so on, Madam President. But as I need to also point out that in 2017, 2018, a lot happened in the governance of this country that we need to also consider hand in hand with these estimates, Madam President. For example, we brought to this chamber, Madam President, we brought things like the road traffic amendment, we brought the previous larceny bill, we brought the employment sexual harassment prevention bill, the police amendment, the minimum wage board, Madam President. In the last fiscal year, we hosted Carrie Festa, Madam President. In the last fiscal year, how many new sixth form schools did we introduce into this country? How many new nursery schools? I lost count, so I don't even have a number written in my notes, because I lost count now. How many new nursery schools, new sixth form schools, Madam President? As I said, there was growth in tourism. We've seen jobs in construction mainly, Madam President. I mentioned the Queen's Park House and the Daphne Joseph Theatre. That happened out of the money from the last financial year, Madam President. We've seen, in terms of governance, we've seen progress on the CLICO and the BICO matter, Madam President. We've seen the deeds, the divestment program, Madam President, progress being made on ensuring that those houses that have been occupied for 20 years and persons are current paying for 20 years on those units, that they're closer, some of them may already have, but that more of them are closer to getting those deeds in their hand, Madam President. That's where the money went. I mentioned just now a subvention for the engineering and the surveying. That's where the money went, to ensure that Barbadians can do these things. So let's look at it in perspective. We've seen in the last fiscal year the appointment of teachers. How many teachers? I don't even know. Hundreds of teachers. We've seen the appointment of teachers in the last fiscal year. We've seen work done, Madam President, on ensuring that more civil servants are appointed, Madam President. We heard our Prime Minister say that these are in the process now, and that very shortly more of them will be getting their appointment letters. We've seen, for example, in my ministry, Madam President, the Barbados Employment and Career Counseling Services be able to send more people for training and retraining and retooling, Madam President, be able to help folks in terms of creating careers for themselves, folks who've been laid off. We've been able to see, Madam President, work on a migrant labor policy, Madam President. We've been able to see work on a labor market information survey, Madam President, that will allow Barbadians, employers, guidance counselors, students, everybody, Madam President, to be able to understand where the jobs are in Barbados, where the jobs are coming, and what they need to do to be able to prepare for those jobs. Those are things we've done. We've seen hundreds of CVQs and NVQs, Madam President, being issued in this year. CVQs and NVQs, again, allowing people to be able to get jobs, Madam President, because they're certified, their skills are certified. And these are not just, we haven't been handing these out. It was no lucky dip. We've been training people, Madam President, and assessing them so that they have now CVQs and NVQs in a variety of areas. The Ministry of Health has been able to open a new lab, Madam President, the Best Dos Santos lab right there on Martindale's Road, Madam President, a multi-purpose, state-of-the-art lab with 9 departments, which include molecular biology, chemical microbiology, immunology, Madam President, enterics and parasitology, mycology and air quality, serology, Madam President, and indeed the lab will continue to test food quality as well as water quality. And you know, Madam President, I just want to say a word on that, because the Ministry of Health, also to what they've been doing in this past financial year, Madam President, the Ministry of Health continues to test our water quality. They have been testing water quality, Madam President, for many years. They conduct water sampling on a weekly basis throughout the island, Madam President. Laboratory analysis of water samples taken throughout the country's distribution system are conducted at this very lab, Madam President, the Best Dos Santos Public Health Laboratory. And in fact, Madam President, with the malfunctioning of the South Coast sewage plant, and we've seen the overflow of the sewage, Madam President, although they know that the water main, the potable water lines and the sewage system are not connected, the Ministry of Health has stepped up its sampling frequency in that area, Madam President. with both chlorine residual and bacteriological samples being done on a weekly basis in that area, Madam President. And these samples, Madam President, to date, continue to comply with the World Health Organization standards for potable water. In fact, Madam President, they are better than what is articulated for the World Health Organization, Madam President. So again, don't let anybody try to mamagai you, Madam President. We have been able to, and try to frighten you about the quality of our water and so on. We have continued to do our testing, Madam President, and our water continues to be good, potable water. I believe this is some of our tap water too. Madam President, we've done work on refurbishing the psychiatric hospital. And of course, I've spoken many times to the work on several police stations, including the new one at Hastings, work on several police stations that has gone on. That is what has been happening, Madam President, in this last financial year, 2017 to 2018. So it was not just about the figures on paper. This is just so you can put in context, so you can have an image, Madam President, of where this money has been spent, what we have been doing with this money, where we've been putting the focus, Madam President. So while our eyes are still on the debt, on the deficit, on the international reserves, we also remember we have a country to run, Madam President. It is why we may not be able to always achieve our goals every year, because as things come up, you have to deal with them. So you may need buses, you may need to deal with garbage, you may have a sewage issue, and we all know from the management of our own purses that sometimes you have to readjust your priorities and decide, you know what, we wanted to get to this point, but we have this urgent thing to deal with. And so we realize that in managing a country, that is also a reality. But at the end of the day, Madam President, we have continued to make gains, we have continued to see growth. And of course, we always realize that Barbados, of course, we are impacted by what is happening around the world, including fuel prices. The oil prices have gone up, Madam President. We have seen, for example, Madam President, that commodities prices have increased, Madam President. So these things also impact us. Things like Brexit, they impact us directly through our tourism and in other ways. These are realities that we have to deal with. And as they come up, we have to adjust our goal. And we have to realize, okay, we may not make it quite where we want to be, but we're still moving forward. We continue to press toward that mark, Madam President. We also have to deal with the challenge of implementation. I mentioned it earlier, Madam President, because we have a lot of projects that have been articulated, but we have to ensure that these are implemented and implemented faster. And of course, issues of business facilitation, Madam President, they continue to command our attention, because we do realize that we need to improve our business facilitation, how we do business, if we are to attract more foreign as well as local investment, Madam President. And we have to build resilience, because as I mentioned, there are things that happen overseas that affect us and will always affect us. The price of oil, for example, will always affect us, but we are working on our renewable energy program, because that is going to help us to build resistance when the oil prices, should the oil prices ever get to those unsustainable levels again, Madam President. At least we would be able to say that we are energy sufficient. We need also to build food security so that shocks overseas, things that happen overseas, will not affect us, Madam President. And then, of course, we do live in, some may argue that this is not the hurricane belt because Barbados has been spared, but we live in the tropics. And Madam President, God forbid, should a hurricane or any natural disaster hit us, we also want to be in a position that it doesn't wipe out entirely our gains, although we know that anything that has, like what has befallen our neighbors, would certainly set us back quite a way. But we want to be able to be in a position that at least you can find your footing again, Madam President. And those are things that we consider as we plan for not just the next year, but as we plan for the future, Madam President. This is what we want Barbados to have. So, Madam President, the estimates then that we have before us, this document, is for 2018, 2019, Madam President. The fiscal program, Madam President, presumes current revenue of $3.233 billion on the accrual basis, current expenditure exclusive of amortization at $3.241 billion, Madam President, and capital expenditure of $393.3 million. While the projections on an accrual basis show a net operating balance of negative $8.5 million or 0.1% of GDP, when converted to the cash basis, there is a fiscal balance of $321 million or 3.3% of GDP, and an overall fiscal deficit, Madam President, of $1.365 billion, which is 14.2% of GDP on the Accountant General's basis. This is the financing that would be required during 2018-2019. On a cash basis then, Madam President, current revenue is projected to increase by $98.2 million, or 3.3% of the revised 2017-18 level, to $3.098 billion. On the accrual basis, Madam President, the estimates of current revenue have been constructed on certain key assumptions, and those are a real GDP growth of 1.2% and a nominal GDP growth of 2.2%, inflation of 5.6%, import cover of goods and services at 6.3 weeks, tourism GDP growth of 2.7%, traded sector growth of 2%, and growth in retained imports of 3.3%. The retained imports are estimated at $2.9419 billion, Madam President. Taxes on incomes and profits, Madam President, are projected at $837.6 million on the accrual basis. When bad debts are taken into account, the amount to be collected on a cash basis is expected to be $812.6 million, which is an increase of $18.6 million, or 2.3% from the amount projected to be collected in this current year that we're in here. Income tax is expected to have a slight increase, Madam President, $6 million, to produce $488.8 million, and corporation tax is expected to increase by $12.5 million, or 4.7%, carrying it to $281.5 million. Taxes on property also expected, Madam President, to increase to realize $141 million, which is $1.1 million more than projected for 17-18. On the accrual basis, taxes on goods and services are projected at $1.505 billion, and on the cash basis, the taxes collected, these taxes, during the year are expected to increase by $43.2 million, or 3.1%. The tax category, the taxes on goods and services, Madam President, does receive its main impetus, as I mentioned before, from the VAT and excise duties. And these, in particular, are expected to contribute $950.9 million in the case of VAT and $317.6 million in the case of excise duties, Madam President. There's also an amount of $36.3 million that is expected to be received from the tax on bank assets. Import duties are projected at $250 million, and that is an increase of $8.3 million. Special receipts are expected to decrease by $15.7 million to $176.6 million. And as far as the National Social Responsibility Levy is concerned, Madam President, an amount of $146 million is projected for that particular levy. Non-tax revenue is also expected to increase by $23.4 million over this current year, Madam President. As for expenditure, current expenditure on the accrual basis, exclusive of amortization, of $891.5 million is projected. The amortization is $891.5 million, so the current expenditure on the accrual basis is projected at $3.24 billion. And when converted to cash basis, and bad debts and depreciation expenses, Madam President, are excluded, the current expenditure is expected to increase by $31.3 million, or 1% over the revised figure for this current year. Wages and salaries are expected to increase above the revised amount by $59.8 million, carrying it to $783.4 million. Expenditure on goods and services also expected to increase by 22 million. Current transfers, Madam President, expected to decrease from the amount revised in this year, 2017-18, and that decrease is projected at 74 million, or 6.2%, to $1.116 billion. The Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, however, will expect, as usual, supplementaries from Transport Board, University of the West Indies, and Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And of course, you know, Madam President, that we are working with the other state-owned enterprises. A lot of work has been done. We've had work that was done by, I believe it is KPMG has done work on the state-owned enterprises. We've seen work done by the International Monetary Fund, Pricewaterhouse, sorry. We've seen work being done, assessments of our state-owned enterprises to bring the challenge there, the transfers and so on there, and the inefficiencies in any of those areas where there are inefficiencies, to bring those under control. Of course, all of this was articulated in several budgets in the past, but it speaks to one of the challenges that we've had with rolling out some of these plans, the implementation. In fact, we do know, Madam President, that is a challenge, because year after year when we have our financial statements and budgetary proposals, when we come back, we do realize that we don't have 100% implementation of the plan. In fact, sometimes it's nowhere near 100%, above 50%, but not where we would want it to be. And that is one of the challenges that we have to address. Again, that's in the Sustainable Recovery Plan as well, speaking to how we implement those plans, because these are not plans that anybody got up in the morning and said, sounds like a good idea, let me put that in my speech. These plans that have been articulated are plans that, you know, assessments have been done by internally in the various ministries. They've been done externally. We've had consultants, local consultants, international consultants do some of this work, so we realize what has to be done. But one of our challenges continues to be implementation. And that is why the framework set out in the Sustainable Recovery Plan that speaks to oversight and monitoring will also help to ensure that we get better implementation of these very worthwhile plans that have been articulated from time to time, Madam President. This plan, of course, builds on the economic sustainability and recovery plan that was articulated in the last budget. But Madam President, I'm very excited about this Sustainable Recovery Plan because, as I mentioned before, this is our social partners coming to work together, Madam President. We have seen, for example, in the 90s when our social partners came together and together charted a way forward. We've seen in the challenges that we've had since the onset of the financial crisis, Madam President. We've worked with our social partners, we've had our working groups, we've had our the action teams, competitiveness action teams. We've had the social partners come on board. And now they're here to say, all right, we want to take on greater responsibility as well in ensuring that Barbados gets to goal. We will help with the articulation of this plan. And not only will we help with the articulation of this plan, but we will help with the implementation and the monitoring and the oversight of this plan, Madam President. And I take my hats off to those in the private sector and those in the labor movement, Madam President, who've all come on board to say, let's join hands and show we love Barbados, Madam President. Now, there are those who might not like the plan, but at the end of the day, Madam President, this is the plan that Barbadians came up with. Every sector of our society, Madam President. The private sector came together, the labor movement came together. These are the civil servants. This is not just the cabinet ministers that sat down with this, Madam President. The technocrats in the ministries, they've worked with this. So I find it hard to see how anybody would want to say they will throw the baby out with the bathwater because they don't agree with this plan. This plan, Madam President, has the buy-in of Barbadians. This has the buy-in of Barbados. Madam President, just a glimpse at this plan, if yes, I believe time will allow me just to look briefly at this plan. There are 4 thematic areas in the plan identifying the challenges that I've alluded to already this morning. Fiscal sustainability or growth or foreign exchange challenges, and of course, we want to ensure that our social services delivery continues to meet the needs of the vulnerable in Barbados. There are, with those 4 thematic areas, there are 6 broad goals, Madam President. Goal number 1 is to build, and this is already a document of the Chamber, goal number 1 is to build a comfortable net international reserve level by 2021. Remember I said that this is seeing us carry actions through to 2021 and beyond. To achieve fiscal sustainability, also goal number 2, to achieve fiscal sustainability through a balanced budget by 2020-21. If I can go back to goal number 1, building the a comfortable net international reserve level. Boosting foreign exchange earnings by creating more attractive conditions, Madam President, for foreign direct and portfolio investment, for business facilitation and building the export growth potential, Madam President. Under goal number 2, achieving fiscal sustainability through a balanced budget, not something we can do in this particular financial year, but we're looking at taking all the issues that we have into consideration, looking at achieving this by 2020-2021. And it involves implementing the public financial management reform, and including a new Financial Management and Audit System Act for the state-owned enterprises to govern the financial affairs of those statutory entities, Madam President. Also to establish an annual medium-term fiscal strategy framework that coincides with the annual debt strategy and the budgetary estimates of revenue and expenditure, implementing a tax policy reform and tax administration upgrade project, reform of the state-owned enterprises. I mentioned that is something we have to do, and that will include mergers where necessary, some new legislation where that becomes necessary, operational consolidation and divestment. And as I said, work has been done by consultants, both local and overseas, and to point us in the direction where some of this has to happen. Some mergers, some consolidation, some divestment, Madam President. And also incentives regimes and legislation to bring that to pass, Madam President. Goal number 3 is accelerating the real GDP growth. The aim here is to reach 3% by 2021, Madam President. And to do that, the aim is to facilitate physical capital formulation projects for critical sectors. These sectors include tourism, agriculture, energy, manufacturing, and boosting the international business environment and information technology and structural reforms. Goal number 4 is a credible and sustainable debt management plan with debt management stabilization and reduction through fiscal reform and debt management plans, an annual medium-term debt management strategy to define the debt goals and assess the portfolio risks, and to set achievable long-term targets on a continuous basis. Also undertaking strategic market-neutral liability management operations to smooth the debt service requirements, because we do know that that becomes a challenge when those debts have to be serviced, Madam President. Also improving communications with our creditors and stakeholders. You know, just last week I was here encouraging Barbadians to do just that, to improve communications with your creditors and your stakeholders, because that is important when push comes to shove. And adopting a risk framework to quantify the contingent risks and to improve the management of government guarantees. Goal number 5 is enhancing and safeguarding the provisions for social development that I referred to. So that includes social sector reform in critical areas: health, education, sanitation, social care. Means testing for accessing social services, something that we've talked about time and time again. And implementation of the national energy policy to make Barbados, as I said earlier, energy independent, and the aim here is by 2035. And finally, Madam President, goal number 6 is the employment, and the aim is to reduce unemployment levels to an average of 8%. Personally, as Minister of Labour, I would like to see it lower, but I believe that when the plans actually take root, that we could actually see that come down. But the aim here is to no higher than 8%, Madam President. Right now it's hovering around 10%. And, you know, it has not been easy keeping employment levels at 10%, Madam President. In fact, we know that throughout the region, we see employment levels at 20%, 30%, 50% unemployment levels, that is, Madam President. And this is another positive that we have to really highlight. This is another area that we need to congratulate the government. We need to give ourselves as Barbados a pat on the back, because we have been able to maintain employment levels unemployment levels now at about 10%, Madam President. No mean feat. no mean feat. It took a lot of doing. It took a lot of effort by government to ensure that, look, we have to do things to keep people employed, so that when you were faced with the decisions of making more cuts here and more cuts there that could bring us to goal, that could balance the budget, yes, they can balance the figures on paper. But we also realize that there is significant value in keeping people employed. And so our policies, while we describe growth as sluggish, and we will use terms as modest and these kinds of words in describing our progress to date, Madam President, a part of that is because we've also realized that as much as possible, we have to keep Barbadians employed. So you had to balance those efforts, Madam President. And yes, we've been able to maintain employment levels. Unemployment now at about 10, it's gone down to 9, so now it's hovering between 9 and 10%, Madam President. As I said, I don't take any comfort in the fact that other countries have 20 and 30% unemployment, but it does bear out the fact, Madam President, that we've had to work hard to ensure that we keep our unemployment at these moderate levels, Madam President. So the goal number 6 will see us creating an environment for sustainable employment opportunities to keep people employed, to reduce underemployment among the youth and the ministries of education, culture, labor. We will be working together in that regard. I mentioned labor market information. That's an important part of young people knowing what is out there and what they have to do to be able to get those jobs. And to explore opportunities with migrant labor programs, realizing, of course, that where other countries, though, are facing challenges with their own employment, that is not always the open door that we would like it to be. I have said before that we've had our challenges, for example, with Canada and getting our workers on the low-skill program there, because when Canada experienced growing levels of unemployment, they also put measures in place to ensure that they tighten the screws on that program and limit the numbers of people that come in, because they have to take care of their own first. They have to ensure that their unemployment levels are managed. And so while we do continue to explore opportunities abroad, we are mindful of the fact that everybody has their own challenges as well, Madam President. So those are the broad goals. There's a lot in here. This book, Madam President, there's so much in here. It is quite engrossing, actually, to read this document, Madam President. But it shows what happens. We've gone beyond consultation. We've gone to the point of collaboration. And we have a plan here, Madam President, that has certainly the buy-in of the Cabinet of Barbados. It has the buy-in of the government. I know it has the buy-in of every one of the senators here on this side. And so we will continue to build on our achievements, Madam President. And as I did before, I want to endorse the public servants, the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Finance, his team, for all that they have done, and then all those other ministries, tourism, education, all those other ministries, and the folks there that have done their part in ensuring that Barbados can be where we are today. And as I said, it is only when we encourage them that we can help them to move forward, rather than to berate their efforts, Madam President. They've kept us afloat. Contrary to what some are saying, Madam President, this ship is not sinking. This ship is very much afloat, and this ship, Madam President, is moving forward. And so, Madam President, this document, as I said, there are 4 thematic areas: the fiscal sustainability framework, the growth policy framework, public sector productivity, and I've spoken to the need for public sector productivity. In fact, Madam President, in this document, and I will say it here too, public sector productivity is highlighted as one urgent area that we have to address. One key area, Madam President, that we have to address. Because, as I said before, some of the strategies in this document, some of the strategies that we will see articulated elsewhere, have not been articulated for the first time. They are there, they've been articulated before, but we haven't seen that implementation of these certainly some of the projects that will bring money in. When they're not moving, then we have a challenge. And so we need to get things moving. We need to improve the productivity in the private sector so we can see better disbursement of funds. These funds come as foreign exchange. So this is one of the reasons why we have to improve public sector productivity. And it also means that when you improve public sector productivity in the areas that are responsible for doing business, setting up business, getting a license, doing this, doing that, doing the next, then we can, when people are encouraged by how smooth it is to get this done, then more people are likely to start businesses, more people are likely to come to Barbados to invest, Madam President, and less of our innovative ideas are likely to go begging. I believe that we do have a lot of, not only young people, but there are a lot of people out there with innovative ideas. But getting it off the ground, sometimes they meet too much red tape. They carried ideas somewhere, they can't get assistance, they can't get financing, they can't get registered. There are all these challenges to creating an opportunity out of this idea and ultimately creating wealth out of it. And I believe that when we improve our processes in the public sector, we will also be able to create a more enabling environment for, Madam President, those innovative ideas to really be sown, those seeds to be sown and start to take root, and we can see yet another area of economic activity then develop. We are ripe for that kind of activity, Madam President, that kind of innovative work in all areas, renewable energy, IT, in communications technology, Madam President, in so many areas, in the cultural industries, Madam President. Yes, we have the legislation that has established the cultural industries Development Authority, Madam President, but again, we have to ensure that the productivity is at its highest there and that bureaucracy is kept to a minimum in those areas. Otherwise, good cultural projects also will go a-begging. So that is one of the important things that has been highlighted in this Sustainable Recovery Plan, Madam President. And I repeated it because I think that that is foundational. That is certainly very, very important. We've mentioned and we've articulated in here and through various speeches from ministers, things like the duty-free zones, Madam President, certain tourism incentives, philanthropic incentives, Madam President, food import substitution projects. These are things that have been mentioned, ideas that have been put forward, but they don't actually get off the ground, sometimes because of the lack of implementation or the slow pace of implementation in some of the departments that are responsible, Madam President. One of the things this document also looks at is linking wages with productivity as well, and that is something that the unions have agreed to work on with the civil service to develop a matrix to ensure that that happens, Madam President, because we do agree that civil servants need increased wages. We do believe that the workman is worthy of his hire, and that in every sector, public and private, that there should be opportunity for wage growth. But what we also have to ensure, Madam President, and the document speaks to it, is ensuring that wage growth is in line with productivity in the public sector, that it is also in line with our monetary and fiscal policy, Madam President, and that it doesn't undermine our macroeconomic and our fundamentals, those things that we've articulated. So we have to ensure that while we want to give improved wages to people, that you have to take it in context. You have to ensure that those goals that we've set, we can still meet, that those certain fundamentals remain intact, Madam President, and that it is aligned with productivity. We have several examples of productivity measurements and several agencies that have tried to implement productivity measurements. I've certainly been involved in a couple of wage negotiations, Madam President, where some of these statutory agencies, in this case statutory agencies, articulated a productivity assessment, a performance appraisal system, Madam President. But again, because it was not implemented, it led to challenges with persons getting their salaries increased on a basis of such a system. So that then we had to come to the table and negotiate what would be an appropriate arrangement in the interim, very often falling back in line with what government does for increments. Again, because some of these agencies don't have their own policies, and so those have to be articulated. Legislation also has to be prepared, as I mentioned earlier, to ensure that state-owned enterprises can manage those things more efficiently, because where that doesn't happen then, as happened in the case of some of these wage negotiations, you set out a performance appraisal system, you don't implement it, then you have to go back and use civil service, very often the civil service arrangements, to give the increments, and some other arrangements sometimes that we may have to negotiate to ensure that you can see improvements in the salary, but these then would not be tied to performance, because you can't go back and say to somebody, well, I'm going to give you a salary increase on a basis of your performance over the last 10 years, but I haven't been recording your performance for the last 10 years. How can you give me a salary increase for my work 10 years ago when you haven't been measuring it, when you haven't been documenting it? So you now have to go back and across the board give everybody salary increases that reflect in no way the work done and the productivity of the individual, the unit, the department, or that organization at all. So that is something that we really have to be firm on, that performance appraisal system, Madam President. That is very important. Madam President, I mentioned the growth policy framework, looking at the public sector productivity. And as I mentioned, Madam President, this document also looks at foreign exchange. It looks the foreign exchange policy, the identifying the critical factors in that area, Madam President, speaking to the fact that any foreign exchange reserve policy framework must consider the confidence in the Barbados economy and the fixed exchange rate. That is something that I think it is underscored in this document, that all the partners want us to maintain that fixed exchange rate, and so our work is to ensure that. Real growth and investment also is another factor, the capital inflows and the debt strategy, and of course, again, the fiscal deficit and the related fiscal issues, Madam President. So these are things that we have to consider in the foreign exchange framework, looking at strategies that would reverse the challenge that we're facing with our foreign exchange stock, Madam President, looking at the feasibility. I mentioned just now the duty-free zones, for example. That is something included in the plan, something that has been articulated in earlier financial statements, but again, not implemented, Madam President. Alternative energy projects, something that we've started on, but we need to pick up the pace on that. Again, brings us back to the issue of implementation. Establishing a nexus between the concessions received and investments and the actual foreign currency received through foreign direct investment. The export earning oriented companies should be prioritized for VAT refunds, Madam President, and other incentives should be given, for example, to tourism stakeholders so that they can reinvest and attract foreign investors. And the idea under all of this, Madam President, is that when government can get this done, we want to see the confidence improve, because at the end of the day, we've been saying private sector-led growth. But the private sector has indicated that they have not been able to lead the growth in the way that we've seen happening in other countries and in the way that we want to happen here. The private sector will not invest when they're not confident, because they're not seeing the productivity, they're not seeing the processes supporting them, they're not seeing that enabling environment being created in the public sector. So government has decided, yes, we have to be able to facilitate better the private sector so that they are more inspired to invest, to grow their businesses, to employ people, and to ensure this private sector-led growth. That's what we want. At the end of the day, a lot of these things have to be taken on by the private sector. But they've indicated, and we've heard, that the reason they have not been able to do some of these things that we've been looking to them to do is that there are challenges with the facilitation, and therefore their confidence, we need to restore their confidence. So, Madam President, that is what we have proposed to do, and that is what we will do, Madam President. And as I said, at the same time, we'll be looking at these projects, Madam President. We will also, again, philanthropy is mentioned here, something that we've started talking about, Madam President, and public projects. Again, the implementation, they're public projects. When we get them implemented, again, we can see greater disbursements. We've had some projects over the years that never really got off the ground, and because of that, you couldn't see the money coming in from various international financial institutions. You know, they wanted to assist with whatever project, but because sometimes the paperwork, sometimes the land surveying, whatever the project is, sometimes these things have happened, and that money went a-begging. We cannot afford to have those opportunities going a-begging, Madam President. So this is why we have to continue to put emphasis on the implementation of some of these public projects that would bring in the much-needed foreign exchange. The National Tourism Program, the CAF Tax Administration Infrastructure Reform Program, the CAF Water Infrastructure Rehabilitation Program, the European Investment Bank Drinking Water Network Rehabilitation Program, Madam President, and the deployment of cleaner fuels and renewable energies in Barbados. All of these things, Madam President, if implemented, will allow us to see the greater disbursement of funds, foreign exchange, into the public sector and into our bank, our system, Madam President. And so, Madam President, I'm sure that during the course of the day, the course of the next few days, we will be looking more particularly as we look at various ministries at where some of them fit into the sustainable recovery plan, Madam President. But I just want to mention a few of the things, Madam President, that having articulated how much money is going to be spent, Madam President, how much is going to be spent on capital projects, how much is going to be done as transfers to state-owned enterprises and so on, just to give a snapshot of some of the things that are going to be happening, Madam President, in this coming financial year 2018 to 19. A few of the major activities to be financed during this coming 2018 to 19 fiscal year. Of course, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital will receive a subvention out of the monies I mentioned of $145 million, a current subvention and a capital subvention of $3.8 million, Madam President, out of these estimates. Madam President, I want to just spend 1 minute to congratulate the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. I don't know if it has been publicized enough, but the Queen Elizabeth Hospital has recently received accreditation in some key areas. For example, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, their baby-friendly recertification. They've achieved that recertification, and it is only one of 2 hospitals in the region, Madam President, that's received that certification for breastfeeding. You know, this is something that we may not, it doesn't feature in our financials, so we may not talk much about it, Madam President. But the Queen Elizabeth Hospital has received that certification. They continue to pursue hospital-wide accreditation and benchmark their operations against standards, against internationally accepted standards, and so to raise the bar, Madam President. At the end of the day, that should be exciting news for every one of us, because it is important to us to know that Queen Elizabeth Hospital is there on par with others, that they continue to set standards and they continue to strive for those standards, because who knows, there but for the grace of God, any of us could be today or tomorrow. So we need to ensure that we support them in that regard. Madam President, in terms of the accreditation that they've received also, the Queen Elizabeth Hospital kitchen, Madam President, is the only public health food service operation in the English-speaking Caribbean to have achieved the certification, Madam President, the improved food safety certification, the only one to have that, and Madam President, as I said before, they're one of only 2 countries that have the international designation for promoting breastfeeding. Our hospital is continuing to strive to international standards. And I think, yes, we must applaud that. Imagine that, the only public health food service operation in the English-speaking Caribbean to have that distinction of that certification, Madam President. And they have continued also to do upgrades, and as I mentioned, there is a capital subvention of $3.8 million being provided in these estimates to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital so that they can continue to improve, Madam President. I also mentioned earlier the laboratory and the work they're doing. While we're on health, Madam President, the drug service, they have achieved savings, Madam President, mainly because there's been that oversight to ensure a reduction in wastage, Madam President. Again, this is why productivity is important, because it is foreign exchange that we use to buy these drugs. It is foreign exchange that is used to finance our drug service operations. And so they have been able to achieve savings. Things that may not make the headlines. Things that may be buried on page 26, like when you hear that our water quality has passed muster, they've done the test, and they bury those things in the middle of the paper. They may never make front page, Madam President, but those are things that are important to the quality of life in this country. Those are things that are important to every one of us, and things that we cannot just let slide without notice and without congratulating those who are responsible for making that happen, Madam President. Also for the 2018-2019 year, Madam President, a subvention, of course, to the Tourism Marketing Inc. will receive $87.7 million, and the Tourism Product Authority, $8.6 million. Invest Barbados will also get $8.3 million for its operations. The CAF Road Rehabilitation Program, $7 million, and then another $7 million for the IDB Road Rehabilitation Program. That is, again, something that affects each and every one of us, the need for rehabilitation. Grant funding also to assist in the Hope Agricultural Training Institute project. That is also very important to us. That is under the UE Food Security Project in the Ministry of Education. I mentioned that food security is one of these things that we must ensure if we are to build resilience against shocks. And it is also important for reducing our imports and spending foreign exchange, that import substitution. And so, Madam President, there will be grant funding of $20 million to assist in that program. A current subvention of $26.6 million and a capital subvention of $2.4 million for the Sanitation Service Authority. There is money in there for the CLICO International Life Insurance to enable the preservation of investments, $17.1 million. The Public Sector Smart Energy Program, $10.8 million. University of the West Indies, their subvention in these estimates is $71.3 million, Madam President. The Welfare Department, as we continue to look after our vulnerable, and we have so many programs in which we do so. In this instance, the Welfare Department is going to receive $19 million to help with the work that they are doing there. And congratulations to the Welfare Department and to the Ministry of Social Care, because the Ministry of Social Care, they have been working not just to give people handouts. Handouts are important. When you have a need, you need somebody to give you a handout. But what is even more important, that somebody sets you on a path for your own sustainable development, Madam President. That is what is important. And the Ministry of Social Care, they have been doing that. They did the IC Bridge program, and they've now started the Strengthening Human and Social Development program. And my ministry, the Ministry of Labor, is also a part of that program as we help in placing people in jobs, because that is an important part of recovery as well for individuals and families. And so congratulations to that ministry and the work that they are doing. Because we are determined, Madam President. I spoke to how we view jobs and the need to help people to find jobs and to retain people in jobs, Madam President, because we are concerned not only about balancing the budget, but we are concerned about people's lives, their livelihoods, the quality of their lives. And that is why the work that is happening at the Ministry of Social Care is also an important part of our program. We want to reduce the debt. We want to boost our foreign reserves. We want to implement projects, Madam President. We want to improve productivity, but we also have to look after the people in this society. That is what government is about, and that is what we are committed to doing in this and other ways. From time to time, Madam President, my colleague, Senator Husbands, has spoken on the Skills for the Future program under that ministry, a very useful program that helps to set young people on a path, Madam President, using sports in the main, and there are other facets of that program as well. But it allows young people, while they're engaged in sports and so on, also to give them those necessary skills for the future, skills for employment, skills for employability, skills for life, Madam President. And that is a very useful program. And $6.2 million has been allocated to the Ministry of Education for this particular program. Of course, I'm sure some of these you will be hearing more of as the debate progresses. $12.2 million for the drug service, for the purchase of drugs, and $15 million for Sam Lord's Castle. The EduTech program, $7.5 million, and $15 million to bring to account the projects of the Water Authority that were funded by CDB and the Canadian Commercial Corporation. So that is just a snapshot of where our money is going, Madam President. As I said, these estimates are for us to approve an amount of 1.7, I forget the amount right now. It was $1.7 billion, the appropriation bill. Yes, $1,744,410,904 is the revised figure after the lower house had done their work last week. That is not in the original appropriation bill, but that is the revised figure, Madam President. And so, Madam President, those are some of the things that are happening across the government. In my ministry, the Ministry of Labor, we are mindful that the mandate of the Ministry of Labor has changed a bit. The mandate of labor, ministries of labor across the world, in fact of our tripartite partners across the world, has changed. It's not just about industrial disputes. It's not just about industrial relations. Industrial relations as an important part of decent work, of ensuring that workers have work, that workers are paid for their work, that they have conditions, decent conditions while at work, that they have social protection after work, when in times of illness or times of unemployment. These are things that ministries of labor have taken on now. That, so that it's now bigger than the mandate one may have initially imagined for a Ministry of Labor, just dealing with disputes and putting out fires. But it's more about prevention. It is more about the quality of life and the rights for workers and employers. It is about creating that environment. That is why, certainly since I've been Minister of Labor, we have been working to ensure that we've brought all that legislation here, the Employment Rights Act, the holidays with pay, the minimum wage, Madam President, there's so many I forget now, the sexual harassment legislation. We brought so much legislation here, not to tick boxes. We have brought that legislation here because it is an important part of ensuring that workers have decent work. Because while we talk about productivity, and I mentioned earlier that one of the things that every Barbadian must do is ensure that they work productively, that they go to work and give an honest day's work. But that is facilitated by an environment at work that is conducive to them giving that 100% while on the job. If the environment is not safe, if there's harassment in the workplace, if their jobs their conditions of work are tenuous, Madam President, if they do not have that security in the workplace, if they don't have dialogue in the workplace, opportunities for dialogue, if they don't have anybody to represent them, sometimes it's a trade union or whoever, if they don't have that type of representation, Madam President, then they are uncomfortable in their place of work. But we have ensured through legislation that they have in addition to trade unions, that they have the tribunals, we've empowered the Labor Department, all of these things to ensure that workers can give of their best while at work, because they can have the confidence and the security while at work. They're secure too in the knowledge of their pensions through the National Insurance Scheme, their unemployment benefits, employment injury benefits as well. All of these things, ministries of labor, and indeed with our tripartite partners, we are working to ensure. It is one of the reasons, Madam President, why as the whole world articulated the 2030 development agenda, right at the center of those 17 goals is goal number 8 is actually speaking to labor. Goal number 8 in sustainable development speaks to the fact that we want employment. We want growth with employment, growth with decent work. And that is what we as a country have signed on to. And that's what my ministry is working towards. So that while I speak to the estimates in general, Madam President, I think it is important that I just spend a moment to highlight the work that the Ministry of Labor is doing, because decent work is important for that sustainability at the individual level. It is important for sustainable livelihoods. We want sustainable economies, but we want sustainable livelihoods as well. And employment and decent work is at the heart of that. So in this coming year, my ministry will continue its program. We started on a very ambitious program, certainly with legislation. And because of that legislation, there is work that has been given, more work given to the tribunal, more work given to the Labor Office. We have enacted a minimum wage board so that that board is established, and they will continue now, they will get started and build on the work of the council, the shops council before them, to ensure that they not only speak to wages, but terms and conditions in several of our sectors, especially those that are not regulated. So that is high on the agenda of this, for this coming year, Madam President, ensuring that the minimum wage board can advise the minister on terms and conditions in some of these unregulated sectors, and there are quite a few out there, and the minimum wage board has already been told what are the areas that are our greatest concern. We have also in its final stages the prevention of discrimination in the workplace legislation, so we expect that that will be here early in the next fiscal year. That is in its final stages. We got a final draft back from the Chief Parliamentary Council. So building on that work of preventing sexual harassment, ensuring employment rights and so on, we will now be bringing legislation that ensures that a worker will not be discriminated against on the basis of color, gender, political affiliation, religion, Madam President, illness, because we're working with our partners in the HIV/AIDS Commission to ensure that there is no discrimination for persons living with HIV and AIDS. So that is important. And we're working on a number of other pieces of legislation, including the protection of wages legislation also. We have begun a review of the Employment Rights Act because there are a couple of issues that have reared their heads since the implementation of that act, so we're doing that, and we have already begun work to improve the tribunal. We've identified where the bottleneck is in cases reaching the tribunal. We've identified that the challenge is not with the tribunal itself, but with the cases reaching to the tribunal. So having identified those challenges, 2017-18 will see my ministry working now. We've already started to put some of the measures and the people in place to build capacity to ensure that we can clear that backlog, Madam President. Of course, the National Employment Bureau has been strengthened, and it is now the Barbados Employment and Career Counseling Services, quite a mouthful, so we just say BECCS, B-E-C-C-S. So we have done our work to ensure that they can provide better counseling services. That is also a very important part of sustainable livelihoods, people knowing what jobs are there, getting counseling, getting advice on work, so that they can, and we don't just give advice, you help the Barbados, the BECCS, Madam President, they assist people in how to go for the job, what is the best fit for you. They give them that kind of counseling, Madam President. And we're certainly looking to improve that. We do realize that sometimes folks, especially those who are unemployed, who have to leave Colamarock and go up to Warrens, sometimes they're not satisfied that they've gotten their money's worth after having spent that bus fare to go up there. They're not getting the level of counseling. And so we have been doing some training with the staff to ensure that we can improve the counseling. We're still looking for a location for that particular unit that is more central, but anybody who has worked in accommodations in government understands the challenges in finding suitable accommodations, especially in that area. We're really hoping to be back to bring that particular unit so that closer to town, closer to the national insurance, so that folks don't have to leave national insurance, unemployed folks having to leave national insurance, spending bus fare to go up to NEB to the Ministry of Labor and BECS only just to get a stamp on their card, when indeed they have to have value added for it. We want to ensure that not only do we move them closer, but that they get better services when they do that as well. And I mentioned before the labor market information system. That's very important to moving this country forward, Madam President. The CVQs and the NVQs, my ministry is doing some of that along with the Ministry of Education and Training. That is something that we're doing. We facilitate the retraining fund as well. So that is work that will be continuing, Madam President, through the Ministry of Labor. And I could not afford to sit down without mentioning what my ministry is doing, as I know other colleagues will be looking at other areas as well. I have mentioned some of the things that other agencies will be doing through the subventions and the transfers and so on that they will be getting. But Madam President, we have, as I said, brought these estimates and the appropriation bill to this chamber. I believe it is a document that represents hope, represents encouragement, that along with the Barbados Sustainable Recovery Plan, because we have looked back, we have looked at the past, we have realized that we have made some considerable achievements. We have learned from some of the mistakes that we have made in the past. Thank you, Madam President. And we have articulated a way forward building on our successes. We understand the challenges, the areas of underperformance, Madam President. Those have been clearly articulated for us. And we are committing to addressing the issues, the fiscal issues, the economic issues, the social issues, Madam President. I only mentioned the fact that we have to come together to help to repair the fabric of our society, and I haven't spoken in detail to what the ministries will be doing. I know we will be hearing some of that as different ministries, youth, social care, culture, sports has a program, Madam President, juvenile justice and juvenile liaison program, Madam President. There's so many agencies that are working together. Police, Madam President, all of these agencies working together. And I've encouraged Barbadians to come and be a part of that at your own level, at your community level, on a personal level. Each one reach one. Each of us can be responsible for one young person. Each of us can be responsible for one person that needs assistance, Madam President. Each of us can be responsible for our own productivity in our workplaces. Each of us can be responsible for the garbage we generate in our own homes and how we treat to that, how we reduce that garbage and reuse where possible. It's about personal responsibility as well as government responsibility. We've seen the tripartite partners take up their responsibility, but at the individual level, we encourage that responsibility also, Madam President. This is our Barbados. And we here, Madam President, on the government side, we are committed to giving it our all. Our partners are committed also, and we've heard from them, and you have heard our vision, Madam President, and it's a vision that we all share. Our social partners, as well as other responsible members of our society, Madam President, like colleagues here in the Senate. This is no time for discord, Madam President. It is no time for divisiveness, Madam President. This is a time for unity. It is time for working together. We have a plan. We can choose to spend our time pulling down the plan, or, Madam President, we can get to work on the plan. Certainly, the government is committed to working on the plan, and we have started working on the plan, and our partners are committed to working on it with us. I want to thank all Barbadians for all they have done to help us to build Barbados. I started by saying what we've accomplished in 50 years, and every one of us has a part in that. And I want to thank everyone for what we've done in building Barbados. But Barbados is not yet built. We're at 50, Madam President, 51, and we've only just begun. I mentioned a song earlier, Madam President, and there's another one that came to mind as I was making the notes, and I see one of my colleagues knows it. The Carpenters, 1970. Song says, we've only just begun. We'll start out walking and learn to run. And yes, we've got Barbados as a nation after 50 years has all 51 years has only just begun, Madam President. We have made great strides, Madam President, but we've only just begun. We look at other nations that are 200, 300, 400 years old, Madam President. We now have a ways to go. We have only just begun. We have done excellently for 50 years. I don't think anybody can deny that fact. We cannot, we really cannot but compliment Barbados on what we have done in 50 years, but we have only just begun. The song says we'll start out walking and learn to run, and yes, we've just begun. Sharing horizons that are new to us, watching the signs along the way. I feel like I should be singing this, but I won't, and certainly not after talking for 2 hours. Talking it over, the song says just the two of us, but us with our partners, talking it over, working together day by day. And when the evening comes, we smile. That is what we work towards. That is what we have to work towards. When the evening comes, we can smile. Smile that we've worked together, that we've built the Barbados that we want. We have built a sustainable society, a sustainable economy, a sustainable future for our children. We will be able to sit back when our evening, the evening of our days comes. We can sit back and smile and know that what we are handing to the next generation is sound, that what we are handing to the next generation, Madam President, is something that they can make use of, that they can't just strip and say, I don't want that, that's junk. But they will be satisfied that we are giving them a Barbados that they can work with, Madam President. A Barbados that is socially balanced, economically viable, environmentally sound, and characterized by good governance, Madam President. That is what we will be leaving for our children, Madam President. And so, Madam President, I support these estimates. A document of hope and encouragement. Things are not dismal. This ship is not sinking. This ship is very much afloat. This ship is very much moving forward, Madam President. We are not beyond hope. There is a battle on, Madam President, not just for economy, but realize that the battle is on for our minds, Madam President. The battle is on for our souls. The battle is on to discourage us, to make us throw our hands in the air. For Barbadians, not just the Democratic Labour Party supporters, but for Barbadians to throw their hands up in the air and believe this ship is sinking, there's nothing that we can do. And that is why, as I said a couple of times already in my presentation, Madam President, I urge Barbadians, drown out those noises, those negative noises, Madam President. We have to accentuate the positives, Madam President. That is what we have to do. We have to drown out those noises. Or as that song I quoted mentioned, pandemonium will set in, and that is what we have an opposition that wants to see, pandemonium set in. So we have to ensure that we are careful what we listen to, what we let get into our spirits, into our minds, into our souls, Madam President. I know that in this season we'll be hearing a lot of nonsense, Madam President, but we have to keep our eyes open for ourselves and look beyond headlines. Look beyond the sensational news, Madam President. Look at the facts. Barbados is doing well. Barbados has grown. Barbados is continuing to achieve. It is a place where our people are achieving, Madam President. We have to ignore the doom and gloom. Barbados, together, we've got this. Thank you, Madam President.